allocated uses for their, for options. So they have all those areas that have, they put their uses on it.
Feedback there.
That's my one.
That's why I want to hear what they, because I've asked,
Oh, man, I just opened your mail again. Sorry. There's a card from the Dave King Commission. I don't even know.
I think you keep up on your mail.
You know what, I am on it. I am.
Do I need to go look and see if I got?
No, it is, well, I don't know.
But you
This
didn't
was
get
that-
it in the last.
I got that stack of it.
Then
Yeah,
you're-
that's what
you're
it
good.
is.
Angie, what's your
I got your
schedule like? Do you want to take 30 minutes after this meeting and just do a quick municipal utility?
I do that.
I can do that.
Brandon, can you just stick around? Do that?
Sure.
Could you, oh, I love whipped cream in the car.
Do it. You want to grab one?
You don't have to, but if you're going that way, yeah, thank you.
Okay. That's one.
Hey, David,
Would you like?
will you, yeah.
They're kind of bright.
I love it.
You should go into the other room too. Those lights now,
Just water. Thanks, Joel.
I think that might have been part of the conversation. Now we can take a whole bank
Whatever
now. We
you
can
got.
take a whole.
Yeah.
Oh, you're fine. I'm just sitting here.
These are also, I think, a bright white instead of the soft white.
I was the one that sat down. You're already here.
Is Joel here? Oh, he's getting a
You
drink.
should see my
That's a
bathroom
good question.
that he did.
Rod took charge of that.
You need that for, makeup. and-
That's right.
Quinn's gonna take it out, put it in his drawer.
That's called taking matters in your own hands.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, did he?
Thank you.
I
Appreciate
think
that,
he just
Joel.
put bulbs in these right here, though. He
That
didn't
was
replace.
fully-
the
Any that
fixture.
are the eye.
He didn't replace, he just put
rotating eye
different
ones,
bulbs
that's
in
the
there.
same.
They advertise it as
I know it.
Yeah.
We good to go? Michelle, you ready?
They do.
All right. We'd like to excuse Mayor Westbrook. He had another commitment today, so, but we'd like to welcome everyone to our, I don't know what we're calling this, a special meeting today. It's Wednesday, February 16th at 10:02. We have a guest, Pat Small with Matrix Design Group, who will be giving us a presentation on the Hill Air Force Base Compatibility Use Plan. So we'll turn the time over to you, Mr. Small.
Thank you, Councilmember Halverson. I'm Pat Small with Matrix Design Group. I thank you for taking the time to meet with us this morning on this project. This is something that we've been working on since 2019, and it has, the development of the plan has finally wrapped up. There's some implementation actions that are follow on to the project. So it's important that we continue to have engagement from South Weber City and the other participating jurisdictions in the project. So I'd like to provide you with a little bit of a presentation and then open it up for any questions that you may have. I did bring a number of hard copies of the actual plan. It's also available digitally, and I think Dave can provide you with access to the electronic versions of the report. It's kind of voluminous. It's about 372 pages, but there's one core part of it that's particularly important that I'm going to speak to. And then I have a number of executive summary brochures that I've provided as well that kind of have an overview of the process and the compatibility issues that were identified through the project, and then also a summary of key recommendations that came out of the project. So please feel free to stop me at any point if you have any questions. We don't necessarily need to leave them to the end, but I will begin with my presentation as soon as I can figure out. There we go. So this project began in 2019. The project sponsor was the Layton City. We are Matrix Design Group. We have done probably close to 100 compatible use planning projects at different installations around the country, Air Force bases, different types of mission sets and weapon systems, and Air Force ranges as well. So we bring or brought expertise to this particular plan. It is not our plan. This is simply a process that we facilitated both with Hill Air Force Base and the surrounding jurisdictions that participated in the process. There were, I think, 14 different jurisdictions: Davis County, Weber County, Tooele County, as well as a number of participating cities, of which South Weber City was one of those participants. So I want to provide a little bit of an overview for those of you who may not be intimately knowledgeable about the compatible use plan, talk a little bit about the issues and strategies, next steps, and then open it up for answers and questions. So the compatible use plan is a collaborative community-led project. It was majority funded by the Department of Defense Office of Local Development and Community Cooperation, old CC. But it really is a community-driven process. And the product of the process is a plan that is a body of information to help the jurisdictions understand what the missions are at the Air Force Base, and also for the Air Force to understand what's going on in the surrounding community, so that that body of information can help the leadership in the communities and at the base make more informed decisions. The plan is not legally binding. It is not an enforceable action. The result is a set of recommendations that I'll talk about in a little bit. Just a couple of facts on this slide, why the compatible use plan is important. There are a number of people who are employed, both active duty and civilian defense contractors at the Air Force Base. Those people live in your community. They make an economic contribution to the businesses. So there's a significant value in terms of their contribution, and then there's also a significant economic contribution and impact to the surrounding jurisdictions as well. Hill Air Force Base contributes about $3.7 billion to the state of Utah and the region. So what are the benefits? It's really about balancing the quality of life and protecting the public health, safety, and welfare within those areas that are impacted by Hill Air Force Base. And then for the Air Force Base, it's really about protecting their mission and the public health, well, not public, but health, safety, and welfare of those who are employed and work and fly from Hill Air Force Base as well. So I mentioned that there were a number of jurisdictions that participated. The three Hill Air Force Base installations that were relevant to this plan, not only the main base, but also the Utah Test and Training Range out in Western Utah and the Little Mountain Test Facility out in Northwest Weber County. So we looked at all of those facilities in addition to having participation not only from each of the surrounding jurisdictions, but also regional agencies, federal agencies as well participated in our process. So I mentioned that Layton City was the project sponsor, but we also had two committees. We had a policy committee. There was representation from the city on that committee that provided high-level oversight. When we talk about some of these recommendations, some of them may have political implications, regulatory and policy related. So it was important to have that guidance as we developed the recommendations. And then we also had an advisory committee, which Dave participated in. This was predominantly subject matter experts who really understand the planning framework, how things work in the communities, what's working, what isn't working in terms of the relationship with the Air Force Base. And then we also involved the public. So we had multiple touch points. We had informational brochures. We had public forums that we conducted. Those were predominantly conducted online simply because of COVID. And then we have a project website where people could submit comments relative to the process. And then we also had a public draft of the plan that we published or posted on the project website as well. So those are the key participants in the project. And we really kind of did it in two phases. One we refer to as a discovery phase, and then a kind of a plan development phase. So we initially went through the steps of collecting information, doing stakeholder interviews, compiling and analyzing that information to help us develop the compatibility issues that were identified, and then did our assessment, and then worked with the committee members and the stakeholders and the public on identifying recommended strategies that could help mitigate those issues or prevent issues into the future. So we looked at 25 different what we call compatibility factors, and we organized them into three categories: social factors, resource factors, and development factors. And within that set of 25 factors, we identified 18 with compatibility issues. So what you see up there on this particular slide, those bolded factors under social, resource, and development, those are the number of issues that were identified for each of those factors. So you can see that there's a lot of communication, coordination needed, some land and airspace competition relative to the airspace with Ogden-Hinckley and Salt Lake City International Airport, some water quality quantity issues that were related to PFAS, and groundwater contamination, and the need to better communicate with the surrounding jurisdictions in terms of what remediation the base is involved in, some land use issues, particularly relating to the noise and safety zones, and then some roadway capacity issues as well. So there's kind of a broad spectrum of issues that were identified through the process. There were 43 in total. And when we developed the strategies, we really looked at 6 key areas. So the first 4 on the left-hand side are where the majority of strategies can be addressed through. So information, making sure that the communities understand what those military impacts are and where they are within their jurisdictions. And that body of information also explaining what the profile of the surrounding communities is, so that the installation can be better informed of what's going on in the communities. Communication and coordination, making sure that the right people are talking to each other, that information is being shared. Even looking in terms of partnerships that communities can engage with the Air Force Base. Both communities and the military are dealing with constrained budgets, so where there are opportunities for partnerships. The last 2 on the right-hand side, policies and regulations, those are kind of, I want to say, worst case scenario kinds of strategies, but they have the greatest political impact. So not all strategies will result in policies and regulatory solutions. That's part of the discussion that each of the elected officials needs to have with their constituents relative to those kinds of compatibility solutions. And we'll talk a little bit about those. So how were those strategies identified? We had input from both of those committees, the policy committee and the advisory committee. Also, we got some really good recommendations from the public throughout our process. And then with our background, having conducted these types of compatibility projects throughout the country, we brought our expertise in terms of understanding what's realistic, what works, what doesn't work, and what's politically feasible. And so we ended up developing 110 unique strategies. So we had 43 issues and 110 strategies, some of which are identified on the right-hand side of this slide. The reason why there's 110 strategies is because not every strategy is going to be appropriate for every jurisdiction. So we may have a particular issue where one jurisdiction says, you know what, we're ready and having a regulatory response or solution is appropriate for our community. Whereas another community may tackle that same issue and say, you know what, we'll just deal with that through a communication and coordination process with the installation leadership and take care of the issue that way. So there are different ways that the different jurisdictions and the base can address the compatibility issues that were identified throughout the process. Any questions so far? Okay. So what we really did through our assessment process is we looked at those geographies of where those compatibility issues are relevant. That was really important because we didn't want to create solutions that don't apply to certain areas. We wanted to make sure that the solutions really address those particular areas that are relevant. We call those areas military compatibility areas. And we identified 4 of them for this particular scenario. So we identified a noise compatibility area, a safety, a bird, wildlife, aircraft strike hazard, or BASH compatibility area, and a vertical obstruction compatibility area. The outer boundary of all of those compatibility areas is what we call the Compatibility Area Overlay District. So it's a fairly broad area across the region, but you only care about the impact to South Weber City, and that's what we're going to talk about going through these different overlay districts in compatibility areas. So the compatibility district and the compatibility areas are those geographic areas targeted for specific solution sets. On this particular map, this is all of the military compatibility areas, and in red, I've highlighted the area where South Weber City is located. So there are a number of these compatibility areas that are relevant. This geography is really a planning tool that can be used to address these compatibility issues. So one of the compatibility areas that we identified relates to aircraft noise. And so in the very northwest corner of South Weber City are some of the noise contours in the latest set of noise modeling.
Could you just clarify something for me? Because I've been out on the west end of town and I've used a sound meter and it's 85 easily. So when you have this 65, what area are you, tell me about the noise contour, exactly what that would mean.
Sure. So what happens is the Department of Defense, they conduct noise modeling on a fairly regular basis, but particularly when there are changes in weapon systems. So if there's a change in the type of aircraft, they will reassess the model that they conduct. That model is based on an average, and it's an annual average. It's developed in a certain way. Now, different types of aircraft have different noise profiles. F-35 makes a lot more noise than an F-16. And the type of modeling that's conducted is being reassessed as well. So the traditional noise model that the Department of Defense uses to create these noise contours, that traditional model is not necessarily appropriate for high-profile jet aircraft like the F-35. And so on the left-hand side of this slide are a number of recommendations relative to noise. I think one of the other things that's important to note is that even though noise is modeled on contours, the noise doesn't stop at those contour lines. It's dependent on atmospheric conditions. It's dependent on terrain. There are a number of factors, and then, of course, noise is very subjective. What one person may characterize as the sound of freedom, to a young mother with a baby who's impacted by that noise, it's a whole different scenario. So even though the noise models or the noise contours have been modeled for a certain for the F-35 aircraft, one of the recommendations that came out of the process was to reassess the noise model based on more appropriate modeling for the F-35 aircraft. What that does is it provides a more accurate picture of the noise profile and the noise impact. But then what do you do with that information? So that noise modeling that the Department of Defense does gets incorporated in what they call an AQ study, Air Installation Compatible Use Zone study, that is updated generally every 5 years to look at what the impact of noise and safety and vertical development is within the surrounding communities, also looks at land use within the surrounding communities and makes a set of recommendations. That's a Department of Defense document that really needs to have a level of engagement with the communities to understand, because there are implications within the surrounding jurisdictions. So one of the recommendations that came out of this process was for a greater level of engagement with the impacted communities when those AQ studies are updated for the installation.
So quick question on that though.
Yes.
I've read through this cup, and you do later on go into some recommendations based on some of the different sound areas, but I've also looked at what other cities located rather closely to their own Air Force base and their attempts to help curb some of the noise, especially with the F-35s, is obviously they're a much louder system. And it seems like they're pretty much kind of just rejected, where the Air Force Base usually just comes out and says, well, that is what our planes do, sorry. And we understand that, obviously. I mean, we're not going to have quiet planes over there, and we definitely want Hill Air Force Base there. So as you talk about this and we get into some of the recommendations, if you could also give a little bit of insight into how Hill Air Force Base itself is looking at some of these recommendations, so that we can kind of get a feel of their willingness to work with the communities. Does that make sense?
It does.
But
well, I don't want to follow it up with the but. So the installation has a mission. You know, it's part of the national strategy for protecting the citizens of the country. There are different ways that an installation can address noise compatibility and noise impacts. One of those methods is through how the aircraft operate. So one of the things that we've heard, and to be quite honest with you, through our public process, we didn't hear a lot from the citizens in the north part of Hill Air Force Base relative to noise. Most of what we heard was from the public in the south, at the south end. But one of the things that we heard from the community was, you know, the F-35s make noise. but they make a lot more noise when their afterburners are on. And so part of this process is helping the base understand from a human perspective, not just from a numbers perspective, in terms of what that impact is in the community. There may be opportunities for the base to do more intense activities from the Wendover Airport on the Nevada-Utah border in the western part of the state, closer to the Utah Test and Training Range. But there's also fluctuations in terms of when the aircraft operate. So my understanding is that there's a lot more intense activity right now because of what's happening with Russia. That creates a more dynamic environment in terms of aircraft flying and when they're flying to do those training activities. So there are some things that that the installation can do, and there are some things that communities can do as well. Generally, there are a certain set of uses that are more sensitive to noise, and we call those noise-sensitive land uses, things like residential development, hospitals, child development centers, long-term care facilities, schools and education facilities. Part of the Department of Defense land use recommendations is to restrict those types of uses within certain sets of noise contours. And so they're modeled in 5 decibel increments. So I think one of the other things, and this came out of our public process relative to noise, was from that human element and human perspective of getting the installation leadership to understand what those impacts are directly in the community. And so two things came up. One was getting the installation leadership into the community to experience, because we had residents that said, you know, I'm within the 65 decibel noise contour, but I've got a noise meter. And, you know, when those aircraft are overflying my property, I'm registering at 113, which has a significant impact on my quality of life, regardless of whether I'm inside my house or outside my house. So getting that leadership engagement directly in the community. The other thing, I just lost my train of thought. The other thing was creating a citizen-led, I would say coalition, but a citizen organization to help keep those types of issues on the radar of the leadership at the installation, so that there's that continued awareness. And there were some residents, not of South Weber City, but certainly from Layton, that said, I'm willing to spearhead this initiative. And I'm sure they would welcome participation from other citizens and leadership in the community. The other thing that is in the plan that is relevant, not entirely defined at this point, but the Department of Defense understands that communities are impacted by noise. And in the 2021 NDAA, that federal legislation, they charged the old CC, the Office of Local Development Community Cooperation, with establishing a community noise mitigation program. And that program is specifically targeted to addressing noise compatibility issues with affected communities. There were a number of installations that were targeted in that program. Hill Air Force Base was one of them. The unfortunate thing is that that program is not fully defined at this point, nor is an allocation of funding associated with that program. But it's important that the impacted communities keep that program on their radar so that when it becomes defined, when there is that set of funding, that those communities can take advantage of what that program can do.
I have a question on that.
Yes.
If that program and funding comes through, will that be through a bill or would that be through law? Like, what would that be through?
That would be through the federal allocation through Congress,
Okay.
but it would filter down into the same organization that funded the Compatible Use Plan, the Office of Local Development Community Cooperation. So it would be their charge, and it is their charge to identify what that program is.
Do they have a end date on when that program should be created?
There is not.
Thank you.
And my understanding is they're still trying to work out the details of what exactly that program involves and the funding associated with it.
Sorry, follow-up question. So if you have this citizens committee without this funding, what other things would they be able to accomplish?
Well, I think that depends on, and we would recommend that citizen organization be kind of formalized, have a charter that would identify what their responsibilities would be and the composition of that community organization. The more formal it is, the more likely it is to stay in place if there are any changes in community participation. But I think part of that is education and awareness, making sure that the installation continues to understand that there are these impacts in the community. But it's really up to that community organization to identify what their charge would be. Some of the other things that were recommended as part of the compatible use plan, like having annual noise assessments for the military to identify where noise complaints are coming from, to have a better process for the communities and the public, because you may have residents that are impacted, but they don't know what the process is to voice their concerns or issues. So tightening up the process and making sure that from the military side, the process is clear and transparent for the public is equally important. So making sure that the military process has follow through and follow up with the community as well is very important. The annual noise reporting is critical for the larger Department of Defense to understand, because that information gets filtered up the chain of command. And I'm gonna throw this out there, though it's not what the compatible use plan is really all about, but the base realignment and closure processes that the federal government assesses on a certain basis. That's a decision-making process that happens, every 5 or 10 years. But the DoD and the Pentagon make decisions on a daily basis. So having that documentation in terms of the noise complaints is instrumental, not only for the Department of Defense to understand what the impacts are in the community, but for the installation as well, to help with their decision-making process too. So that's part and parcel of the things that that the installation can do. I started off by saying that the recommendations that come out of this process are not legally binding and enforceable. So it's up to the military as good stewards and good neighbors to coordinate and work through compatibility issues with the surrounding communities, as much as it is for the communities to identify things that they can do as well.
So, Mr. Small, getting back to the details of what affects South Weber on this chart that we got on the screen right now, what exactly does it mean, 70 DNL? I mean, you said there's an average. Is this an expected? Is this the average? We got a little chunk of it there on our west end of South Weber. What does that really mean? I mean, you've got it on there. Somebody's going to look at that. You got it by Washington Terrace, a chunk that's pink. Does that mean it can't exceed that? Does that mean it's a target? Does that mean, why are those
Sure.
there and what does it mean? But just a very quick, short, I know it's into the weeds. We need to get on with your presentation, but I just need to understand, what does that mean?
So that, based on the noise or the type of noise modeling that was currently done for the aircraft that are flying out of Hill Air Force Base, that is what is currently modeled as the noise contour.
That noise isn't anywhere else. So you got that little pocket in Washington Terrace that only gets up
Well,
to
no,
70?
I clipped or cropped this map to be specific to show South Weber City, only because if I extended the map out, I didn't want to lose the perspective for the city. But it does extend kind of linearly around the airfield in terms of the current modeling. We also didn't include it on the installation because those contours do cross the installation, but
So it shouldn't exceed 70, or that's just what we've measured, or what does 70 mean?
Can I step in here for just a second? Because I was here when they initially changed the AQ noise zones and did that study as he described. And we show in our workroom over there 2 different maps. The previous map that showed the concentric lines of the various LDN lines and where the state easements are that are established in the city at the 75 LDN line. And that was based on the modeling capability that they had when they previously updated that. And then when they did this new one, we were told that the modeling capability was much better and that it was more precise, but it is based on an average. And so when the plane was flying, they identified it as much louder than what those numbers show, but it's based on an average throughout the day. And so it's really just trying.
What?
Yeah, so if it was based on when the planes aren't flying, it's obviously nowhere close to 75, but when the planes are flying, it's obviously higher than 75. But it's just trying to identify what is happening now with the noise zones.
And I think when it was presented to us back then, if you remember, because that's why Washington Terrace gets it. They were showing in the modeling like sound doesn't go down in our valley. And I think he's only dealing with the model data that he was provided. And so, I think that's why you just get a pink area here and nothing here. We all understand that that is not a correct modeling. I think that's where he's going to at the end of this too, so.
well, and the reason why there's contours over at the city of Washington Terrace or Washington Terrace City is because of the terrain.
Mhm.
So, and it's also based on the flight tracks of where the aircraft actually fly. So the next question is, so what do those contours mean? And the Department of Defense has produced a set of land use guidance or recommendations. One of the things that's important to note is that the DoD does not have any authority over private land. They only have authority over federally owned land. So they've produced a set of land use recommendations, both for noise and for safety. And they have prescribed uses within each set of those noise contours. And so that's where, when I was talking about those noise sensitive land uses, to protect the quality of life and the public health, safety, and welfare, they say, these uses these uses are not recommended between, the 65 and the 69 set of noise contours, or the 70 or 74.
So I guess that gets back to what I'm asking. That 70 is not telling the public you can only expect 70. That 70 is saying in this area, we have specific things that you should or should not do. That's really what you're saying.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that every jurisdiction adopts.
Right. It's just a recommendation.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions on noise? Okay. So the next set of strategies relate to the airfield aircraft safety compatibility area. These are areas at the ends of the runway where, if an aircraft mishap were to occur, are statistically where they're most likely to occur. So they extend from the ends of the runway in kind of a rectangular pattern. Some of that rectangular pattern is inside the installation, so there's no community impact. And on this particular map, I've zoomed in on the impact area. In the white little boundary, or the white line, is within South Weber City. It also extends at the southern end into Layton City and a little portion of unincorporated Davis County. But there's 3 zones. The most critical zone, where no development is recommended, does not exist in South Weber City, so that's a good thing. That's contained within the installation. But there's a portion of what is referred to as accident potential zone 1 that is within that white area delineated on the map within South Weber City. Within accident potential zone 1 and 2, the yellow box that does not apply, because there's the potential statistically for aircraft mishaps, as they characterize them. The primary goal is to reduce the congregations of people within these particular areas. So certain uses, like residential uses, shopping centers, it gets fairly granular in terms of the land use recommendations. Everything up to places of worship are not recommended within that accident potential zone 1. So in the interest of public health, safety, and welfare, one of the things that that we look to in terms of implementation is how communities incorporate that information into their planning framework, because there are opportunities to do that through the code. Any questions on the safety?
So is it actually more likely for an incident to happen on landing than takeoff? Because I always thought it was the other way around.
I'm not sure the distribution.
Okay.
There are landings, takeoffs, and there are also operations that are called touch and goes, where they're racking up flight hours, doing those procedures. And then, of course, I think one of the most compelling operations are when they're doing the demonstrations that impact the communities as well, when you have that constant flow of aircraft. So I don't know the actual distribution, but those areas are where incidents are most likely to occur. All right, bird, aircraft, wildlife strike hazard. So this is a FAA recommended area. It extends, and you can see in the little inset map, 5 statutory miles from it's a little complex, but it's basically from the airfield at an airport or an installation. And primarily what the FAA says is, here's some recommended guidance for types of uses that can be bird or wildlife attractants that can impact aircraft within this area. This kind of goes along with, bird strikes can cause impacts to people on the ground, can cause damage to aircraft, have a cost implication. And so there's certain types of uses that can impact the attractants for birds and wildlife. So things like golf courses, landfills, land transfer stations, retention ponds. But there are ways that you can design those facilities to reduce their attraction for birds and wildlife. So there are things that communities can do. The FAA isn't saying you shouldn't have a golf course, but if your golf course is going to have water traps, then there are things you can do around them, like putting riprap to discourage birds and waterfowl from congregating there. So there are some best management practices that were recommended in the compatible use plan as well. And then the vertical obstruction compatibility area. And so in the inset there, you see that it's quite colorful. It extends a fair distance from the installation, but it's really a set of 3-dimensional surfaces that surround an airfield. This is kind of a cutaway section of what those imaginary surfaces look like. Some of them are sloped, some of them are plateaued. And
Are you saying this is the flight deck instead?
no,
I don't see anything on the map that shows like the valley being at a lower requirement for these obstructions.
so, and that's a very good point. These imaginary surfaces are in the Code of Federal Regulations. Both the DoD has them and the FAA has them. They are simply above ground level, but they're a little bit complicated to calculate because they're based on the elevation of the airfield. They're based on the elevation at a development site, and they're also based on the height of the imaginary surface as well. So when or whether a natural or human-made structure penetrates these surfaces is dependent on triangulating all 3 of those factors. What most communities do is they acknowledge that the DoD and the FAA have these requirements, and so they incorporate that in their codes and say, a developer has to meet these requirements, but the complexity of how you actually determine whether something could be construed as a vertical obstruction is kind of lost in translation because it is that manual triangulation process, and it is site-specific in terms of where a development occurs. Just as a side note, we've developed models for communities that identify at a 1 meter square grid of what the maximum buildable height is across the entire set of imaginary surfaces in a region surrounding an airfield. And there may be parcels where large parcels where at one end of the parcel, you could have a 100-foot height difference in terms of maximum buildable height. So having that information can even help developers understand how to maximize the height across a single parcel to their benefit. There's no requirement that there's kind of two processes that are involved when it comes to vertical obstructions. There's no requirement that a jurisdiction adopt the FAA or the DoD height requirements. There is a process that the FAA has for development that exceeds a certain height, and that's 199 feet. But development that may be lower than that can also potentially be a vertical obstruction. So you may have trees at the end of a runway. There are Air Force bases that have programs that they initiate with the local city to help educate private owners and have agreements with private owners to trim the trees on those properties that are in close proximity to a runway that may be a vertical obstruction. So it's not just things that we as humans create, buildings, communication towers, even utility poles or temporary construction cranes. It can be natural things as well. So the DoD has their process for structures of certain heights. There's no requirement that communities do anything or incorporate this information into their codes. But what the FAA can do is they can withhold funding for airports. So it's in the best interest of all the affected parties to capture this information and implement this information to the greatest extent possible. So what I've got on this particular slide is the boundary of South Weber City in red and where some of those imaginary surfaces intersect. Some of them are within those sloped areas that are kind of difficult to identify what those maximum buildable heights would be. And I think the other thing that's worth noting is that just because a structure may penetrate the imaginary surface doesn't necessarily automatically mean it's a vertical obstruction. It's when you get a, that's what I'm looking for, aggregation of multiple structures that can affect the navigable airspace. So there's a number of recommendations in the plan relative to what those maximum buildable heights are, including that tool I mentioned that can assist local jurisdictions and staff with understanding and being able to identify whether structures comply with or exceed what those heights are. And we've done that in an automated form where it's as simple as a click of a mouse to identify what that maximum buildable height is. We built that in GIS for communities. Tends to be a little bit more complicated, but we've also built that as just a web-based calculation tool that anybody can go in and identify an area, searchable by parcel, click on the mouse, enter in the height of what they want to construct, and the tool will actually tell them what whether they've exceeded the maximum height or how much leeway there is between what they're proposing in terms of the vertical height of a structure and where that top of the imaginary surface maximum buildable height is. So there's a number of recommendations that came out of that. I do want to talk a little bit about next steps. So there are a number of jurisdictions that are participating in this compatible use plan. The plan is great, but it's not intended to sit on a shelf and collect dust. And while we have just wrapped up the compatible use plan development, there's a hope and expectation that the stakeholders that participated in the process will continue to participate in the implementation. So there's a couple of resolutions that we passed on to Dave One is to endorse the compatible use plan. It's not legally binding. It's not enforceable actions. It's a set of recommendations. So we would hope that all the communities will take that action to endorse the plan. It doesn't mean everything has to be done in the plan, but it's general support in the spirit of the plan to proceed with implementation. The other key thing with implementation is creating an implementation coordination committee. They're not the executors of the strategies, but they would be involved in monitoring the implementation of the strategies. So like the policy committee and advisory committee that participated in the plan development, that implementation coordination committee would help the process through and have that continuity in terms of implementing the strategies. That would be a group similar to the policy and advisory committee that participated in the project. So we also have a draft resolution that we passed on to Dave in terms of endorsing the implementation coordination committee and participating on that committee. That's not something that the city would have to spearhead. It would simply be a function of participating in implementation. And I want to take a couple seconds to talk about implementation because, as I noted, there are 110 unique strategies. Not all of them are going to apply. Different jurisdictions have different capabilities and resources. There are some strategies that are in the plan that require resources, whether that's developing follow-on studies or, even with that 3D imaginary surfaces model, there's a cost associated with some of these actions. Even in terms of working with communities through developing regulatory changes to codes or plans, long-range plans, those can have a cost impact too. The organization that funded the Compatible Use Plan, that Office of Local Development Community Cooperation, they fund implementation. And it's in their best interest to fund implementation because they don't want to see the efforts, the collective efforts and collaborative efforts of a compatible use plan sit on a shelf either. In terms of implementation, there's additional funding to assist with that process as well. We're not expecting that the city would be spearheading that implementation effort. In most cases, the project sponsor of the plan, they also become the project sponsor of implementation as well. Whether that implementation funding is awarded is kind of dependent on a couple of things, one of which is communities demonstrating in good faith and in a collaborative spirit in implementing compatible use strategies that are simple to do and demonstrate a community's commitment. So there are a number of implementation strategies that are kind of like low-hanging fruit, communication coordination things. They don't really require revisions to documents, but they're fairly easy to do in terms of tightening up that influence between a community and an installation. So there are things that can be done that are related to the strategies in the compatible use plan that, if executed, are looked favorably upon by that DoD funding department because the communities are demonstrating that their willingness to take on implementation and further implementation. So that's another component of implementation as well. So those are really the things that I wanted to mention in this presentation, and certainly open it up to you for additional questions or dialogue.
All right, are there any questions?
The only question I had, and you probably didn't come prepared for this, is are there any concerns or things that affect South Weber that we need to look at? I'm sure you've got the 100 and whatever and 42 and whatever, but that's for everybody. Was there any effort made to say these are South Weber's big hitters, or is that for us to do?
Well,
You got it?
I was just gonna say, this executive summary is, I think, is pretty helpful. And there's some things, I think, specifically in here for South Weber.
I think the key things for South Weber are the noise, the safety zone. There was one other component of the noise that was on the map, and I'll just jump back to it. It was a green hatch. Because we acknowledge that noise doesn't stop at those contour lines, we created a 1.5 mile buffer called a noise awareness area to help promote education that there are noise impacts within these areas. The coordination and communication, I think, are big things. I don't think there was anything really unique to South Weber City relative to specific impacts from the installation. And so that's kind of a good opportunity for a couple of things, because there may be things that as implementation occurs, that South Weber City can learn from experiences of some of the other jurisdictions that are implementing strategies. So that's part of that continued collaborative effort. That there are opportunities for learning experiences. Some of those implementation strategies are things that the city can execute independently of anybody else. So there are strategies that are specific to South Weber City. Some of the strategies require a collaborative effort. And so there are different ways that those strategies can be implemented, but I don't think there's anything that was specific or unique to the city that's not experienced in any of the other jurisdictions.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right. Well, we appreciate you coming. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions as we get more into it, but and I'm sure as we talk about the resolutions as well. So
Okay.
we
Well,
appreciate that.
thank you for the opportunity and taking the special time for us to come out and present this to you. We'll continue to coordinate with Dave as necessary. We have reached out to Layton City in terms of facilitating that next phase of implementation and looking at what some of those potential actions that have costs associated with them can be funded through the old CC DOD program, and certainly monitoring that community noise mitigation program into the future. So I think as implementation ramps up and gets organized, I would anticipate that there would be some outreach from Layton City, provided they agree to sponsor additional implementation actions, as well as potentially outreach from the old CC DOD program office as well. I know that they were planning on coming out here and doing outreach with the communities for implementation back in January, February timeframe, but they have some travel restrictions that are still in place for them. But my understanding is they do have plans to come out and meet with the participating jurisdictions as well. So that's something to keep on your radars. And then hopefully when implementation does happen, we'll have an opportunity to help facilitate that process for the South Weber City as well. And we'll have a opportunity to continue to work with you and with Dave through the process too. So I'm going to leave these copies with you all. This morning I sent a link to the electronic documents as well. So I think Dave received that. So that information is all there. If you have additional questions through implementation, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it. All right.
I make a
Dave?
motion, we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.